All right. Hi, Alice.
Hi, Em. How are you?
I'm good. I would love for you to introduce yourself, and the role that you hold.
Sure. I'm Alice Ely, and I'm the Executive Director for the Public Health Council of the Upper Valley. I've been in this role for almost 15 years, which to me is astounding. And really happy to say that this organization, which has been through several births and rebirths over time, but from the very beginning, we're celebrating 25 years.
Wow. Happy birthday.
Well, thank you.
What's the 25th birthday called? A
I
quarter
have
century?
absolutely no idea.
Yeah, me either. Okay. Anyway. Well, that's beautiful. You are like at this point as like a college graduate, maybe with like their a couple years into their first full-time role is what you are, is 25.
I feel like I've got a lot more gray hair than that, but I get it.
Cool. Well, I would love to talk about the work we did together and then, sort of what's happened afterward. So can you share a little bit about like what was going on, when this funding became available and you were looking for grantees and yeah, just sort of how that program ran with the VTCHEP funding.
Yeah. I was just sharing this story recently because we have this new staff person who's focused on health equity and supporting our Upper Valley equity and anti-racism leadership team. And it's such important context for where we are today. We had um, right before the pandemic started, we had pulled together a group of people in the Upper Valley um, who identified as a person of color, different identities, different cultures, et cetera. But they shared this identification as a person of color. And what we wanted to do, what I wanted to do was is really just find out from them what what they needed. And what I was hoping was there would be momentum for them taking some control over getting what they needed instead of those traditional white-led organizations sort of saying, hey, we want to include people of color or people with lived experience on our advisory group or whatever. And then really having them sit in a token role and
Hmm.
answer a series of yes no questions.
Hmm.
I wanted to shift the script, and and yet all I could do was bring those people together and give them an opportunity to decide how they wanted to use that. Um, that group had been meeting for some time, and there were different personalities and different experiences there, but they were moving in the direction of getting to know each other, trusting each other, and thinking about what they wanted the Upper Valley to look like. And that's when this Vermont Community Health Equity Partnership arrived. And our partner at the Vermont, the White River Junction District Office said, well, we need a backbone organization to host this grant locally. We think the Public Health Council would do that. Well, and I I wanted to, but I went to our UV ear group to say, here's an opportunity for us to play a role. It's very Vermont based, but but I think we can use what we've been building so far. And there were a couple of people around the table who had a very strong reaction, and they said no.
Mm.
Not specifically to the Public Health Council, but no to any traditionally white-led organization trying to step in and run a health equity, health disparities focused grant that was
Hmm.
supposed to address the needs of the people who had been affected by the pandemic more than others. And we all know um, that people of color rose to the top of that
Hmm.
list. And and it was a really hard conversation. I had to learn, I had to train myself to listen and
Mm.
to say, you know what? they have every right to be angry about this situation where the state of Vermont laid out these guidelines that says the organizations that could serve this role, you know, have many years of experience and a lot of dollars in the
Mhm.
bank, and they have all of the usual structures. And this group of folks, this small group of folks was like, that's the problem.
Yeah.
In a nutshell, that's the problem. And we, as an organization, and others said, okay, if we won't do it,
Hmm.
but you got to find somebody else who can.
Yeah.
And the sad truth was, in looking around the community, there was no other organization that met their preferred criteria that could serve in the role. And we negotiated with the
Hmm.
group to say, well, okay, if we're going to do it, what do you need us to do? How should we run this? How do we make sure that it promotes the principles that are important to you? Really
Hmm.
supporting grassroots organizations, making sure that the decisions are being made by people of color. And we had that agreement, we put it in writing, and we actually sent a letter off to the state of Vermont to tell them all the ways in which they had screwed up, which actually got some feathers ruffled.
Hmm.
And our division director in White River Junction got a phone call to say what is going on here. But it worked, and what we were able to do is really recruit some of the folks from that group, but a few folks from other places to say, you're in the leadership role. I mean, here's the steps we have to follow, but you're in the leadership role, and we're going to put the decision making in terms of who gets the grants. And I think almost um, as important as anything else, how are we going to publicize that this funding
Hmm.
is available? What networks are we going to use to get the word out? And what can we do as an organization to make it easier for organizations that didn't have all of the money behind them to apply?
Hmm.
And so we were interested, can we find other organizations to be fiscal sponsors if necessary?
Hmm.
Can we give people a little bit of their money up front if they need that in order to begin doing the work? And I learned so much about how finding out what your grantees need instead of just handing them a sheet of paper and saying these are all the requirements, just finding out what they need and how you can go about supporting that is such an important part of building the relationship and the
Hmm.
trust. I'm probably telling you more than you really want to know, but I think in the end, I know that of the 10 grantees, um, probably only 3 or 4 of them are continuing to do things like what they did.
Hmm.
It's um, some of them have left the area, some of them had ideas that failed, but I don't think that was a failure,
Yeah.
right? They had an opportunity to try something and engage with something and feel as if they were supported in doing it. Um, and also, I feel like that was two almost 2 years of relationship building with
Yeah.
people that I hadn't known before.
Right.
Didn't know who you were. There were most of the folks that we funded were people we had no prior relationship with.
Hmm.
And I think that it went a long way to restoring a little bit of trust that
Hmm.
there are organizations out there that will listen and will work with us and will try to give us an opportunity to do something that's for our community.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, and I think that, that's the process you just explained is at the core of, all the work that I do, and I think what you and I agree on is like the core of what public health should be, which is going to the communities and that we are responsible for serving and asking what they need and learning from their wisdom rather than a top-down traditional public health approach of um of here's what we're doing, and then being like, why isn't anybody coming to our programs? And it's like, well, you haven't for
Mhm.
a second listened about what everybody needs. And I think so often the misconception there is that like that's the slower way to go and that it's the less effective way to go. But like time and time again, we see we move faster when there's trust, and that like impact is much higher when we are responding to expressed needs because the communities we serve are the experts in what they need to be well and healthy and thrive, which is what we all know. But it's just, yeah, I think that like that story you just told is such a story of going to the heart of like healing what has been broken in public trust or in public health for so long, through that trust building. And so then for context, so then I was one of those grantees, and the project I did was, as you know, like listening to the stories of BIPOC and queer folks and their experiences of navigating the healthcare system in the Upper Valley, and then creating a report that was shared out widely. And I did a lot of outreach to organizations and individuals and Facebook groups and all sorts of things, signal chats and all sorts of things to gather those stories and have those a part of them. And then I was often struck because a lot of the feedback I got on the report was, but what do we do what do we do now with what we've learned? And you were always a champion of, I'm glad you didn't tell them what to do, and I'm glad they have to figure it out. Is there anything you want to say that? I just love that you were just like, good, you didn't tell them what to do.
Yeah, well, I think that it's it's too easy for folks to say, well, I have a checklist now. Um, I I was at a conference, um, let's just say roughly a year ago, a little less. It was Dartmouth's health e health equity
Mm, hmm.
conference, and a woman who I think is very well intentioned. I think she's now the head of Geisel.
Okay.
But anyway, um, she was moderating a panel, and there was a professor from Dartmouth. I don't know if you're familiar with Emily Walton. She's
Mm,
a sociologist, and she's just published a book called Homesick, um, which may be a little bit controversial among people within the BIPOC community. But I think, again, I think her intentions were good, and her research was, but it's more for for allies rather
hmm.
than it is for people of color itself. But she was talking about, talking to community people and doing the sociology kind of thing. And Amber asked her the question, what are best practices for community engagement? And and I had just walked into the room, and I was standing and I was just like, oh, because she was really like, what is the research
Hmm.
literature on best way to do this? And I she may make a lot of mistakes, but Emily said there isn't one.
Mm,
You just have to do the work.
hmm.
And I was like, yes, I will always remember how wonderful I felt when academic an academic said, "There's no guidebook that tells
Yeah.
you do this step one, step two, step three, right? You
Hmm.
you just have to be in it."
Hmm.
And I could tell that the doctors and healthcare researchers and others in the room were just cringing.
Hmm. Hmm.
Not, it doesn't work for them, but that is the thing. They don't understand. And I'm involved in some community engaged research advisory work where I am constantly saying to people, if your first contact with your desired community partners is in the 4 weeks before your grant application is due, or worse yet, even after you've been funded, and
Hmm.
now you're asking for their input, it's too late,
Yeah.
right? They're never going to feel as if they've had an impact on the way you see your work and what your job is,
Hmm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. And in those cases, you're almost always treating them in the exact way that the thing you're probably got funding to do is like working against, if that makes, you're like treating them in like a tokenized or a like, oh, you will just do what we say and what we present way. And so it's just like, if that's how you're treating them, you've started on the foot of already, like great power imbalances and like not reckoning with any of that in the beforehand. So like,
Right.
where do we go from there?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
So I think it's so hard for professionals, particularly in those environments like, academic, research, et cetera, to understand the the need to move slowly and
Hmm.
maybe start that relationship building before you even know what the work is.
Hmm.
And also, I mean, you said it, but I would say it a little bit differently. When you approach the community, one problem is when you say, this is what we're going to do. But the other problem is when you say, I know what the problem is,
Hmm.
right? I remember in graduate school, one of my professors would say, if you approach a community because you know that their breast cancer data is horrible, and you come in and you say, we want to help you improve your breast cancer screening rates or survival rates or whatever. But what if they say, yeah, we know that there's a lot of women around here who have breast cancer, but what they really want is to make sure that their sons are safe,
Hmm.
right? That they're not getting shot, they're
Hmm.
not, or there's children that are getting sick because the water in the school isn't clean or something along those lines. If you don't address the things that they're most concerned about, if you say, well, that's, we don't have money for that, we only
Hmm.
have money for breast cancer, you've lost before
Hmm.
you've even started.
Hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. And something you were saying earlier makes me think of this too, of this like, of the best practices for community engagement and there not being one because the way to do it is to go and build those relationships and build that trust and how it makes like our like professionals and academics and providers uncomfortable and at the same time, like when we really get down to it and start doing the work, it's the most human thing we do in our work. And so it's like, it's sort of this like we expect a framework or we expect some sort of research, but then actually when we can do it in practice, we realize we don't need those things because we just do the most human thing, which is, yeah, like go to people and don't say, I know what your problem is, but rather like, what are you experiencing? What's your lived experience? And like, what do you need to be well? And that's just it's just so much more and like it gets to this you mentioned the slow pace of it and like it can be and it's like going slow so you can go fast. Like I think that I something I've been talking about recently and writing about is like that when we like urgency will never serve us in public health because it adds that sort of buzziness and top downness and decisions are made, but like efficiency does serve us and like a story driven strategy and using story and community wisdom to drive and create strategy is an incredibly efficient way to make like leaps and bounds of progress in public health. We just have to change how we see this sort of like moving fast means urgent and we have to decide, but more so like once you build those relationships and like actually tend to them in a meaningful way, everything can move so fast because like y'all are all going in the same place and you care about the same things and you've like dropped that sort of facade of needing some sort of framework or something and actually are doing like the human to human work that gets things done and like gets work done. And it's something we see all the time in like a lot of the most effective public health work being in mutual aid organizations and it's because of that responsiveness and it's like okay well then how do we as public health practitioners emulate that and or plug into that and or just support what's already happening and like bolster it without being like oh then we should build something that looks like that because building something that looks like that doesn't work as well as doing what's working and not trying to like sort of copy and paste it in an alt like different context.
Yeah. So and I know in the academic world, folks like to talk about replicability, right? How
Hmm.
do I learn? What do I learn here that I can use there? And it's not about putting together a charter
Hmm.
or having a meeting and you have an agenda where people, oh, everybody gets to introduce themselves and you don't replicate those. This is
Right.
not like a box that you can, that what you have to replicate is the humility,
Mm-hmm.
the curiosity, and approaching with open arms,
Mm-hmm.
right? That's what you have to repeat. And if it's in an aisle in the grocery store where you run into somebody and you end up having this amazing conversation, or whether it's while your kids are playing together in the park, or whether it is like we've invited you to come and talk with us about something.
Mm-hmm.
Um, it's the same process in each of those places.
Yeah.
I'm actually not the expert in this room. I need to stop acting like it, and I need to use language to
Mm-hmm.
talk, and I need to accept that this person is the expert
Mm-hmm.
in their life and in their
Mm-hmm.
experience.
Mm-hmm.
And it is hard. I think we can practice it and get better at it. Um, but I've definitely come to understand it. Do I practice it 100% of the time? I'm sure I don't.
None
But
of us can do
also,
anything
once you
100%.
build those relationships, as you said, things can move fast because
Mm-hmm.
while I don't 100% of the time get it right, I have a pretty good sense of what my UV colleagues would think is cool and not cool.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I've asked them. I have people, it doesn't happen as much anymore because they have a level of maturity now that they didn't even a year ago. But I've said, I have people who come to me and say, we want them to be a focus group for us, or we
Mm-hmm.
want access to them.
Mm-hmm.
And I've said, no,
Yeah.
that's not what they want.
Yeah.
Or I've negotiated what can you give them
Mm-hmm.
in exchange?
Mm-hmm.
And they've said, yes, we trust you to understand where we're coming from.
Mm-hmm.
So that's okay if you act as an advocate for us and
Mm-hmm.
to some extent a protector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. And and like you're saying, like over the course of a year, what has changed? And then it's like what becomes possible once that trust has been built is like, is so much more. So it's like, we think about, oh, we don't have a year to do that. And it's like, no, you don't have a year to not do that because like you can't get where you want to go without that. And so it's, yeah,
That's
it's
right.
just so
Yeah.
key.
Yeah. If you're comfortable saying in 1 year from now, I'll be in exactly the same position I'm in now in my ability to engage with this group of people,
Yeah.
then don't do the work.
Then
But
keep doing
if
what you're doing.
keep doing what you're doing, but if you think, oh boy, in a year, I I I'm definitely want to be in a different place,
Hmm.
then get started.
Yeah. Hop to it.
Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and then so after the report that was created from the work we did came out, we did some like presentations and things and question answering. And then you also brought me in, which I think is like something that I want to talk about, to do some like supported storytelling for the other grantees so that they had like videos and other ways that their story was told that was like clear and they could use it to further their work. And I think that's just such a rare and important facet of the way you and your team were looking at this work of like, yes, this is limited funding, but we want tools for folks to be able to tell their story and like increase access to funding because as we know like well-told stories like get the attention of funders and having that clear narrative and all of these things. And so yeah, and so I guess just if there's anything you remember about that time and deciding to like this funding is wrapping but we want to have our grantees leave with something, what brought you to that decision?
Well, I think who brought me to that decision was Zariah Hightower.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
think that was entirely her idea, but it wasn't one that I was going to push back on.
Hmm.
We knew we had the resources to do it, and it felt like exactly the right thing to do.
Yeah.
Independently, these organizations would not have the ability to do that on their own, but by identifying that you were actually a really good person to help them frame their stories, we had everything together. And it felt like it was a gift that we could give people who had been doing really hard work.
Hmm.
And I know I see Earl Hatley occasionally from the
Mm.
Ottaquechee Water Protectors, and he says they still use that video.
Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
and I
Yeah.
still use pictures from some of those videos in my materials.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And just that, it's a little bit back to also what we were talking about of like you can't just like copy and paste certain things that work in some places and in others. And I think like in rural settings, like the ones we operate in, you can't just be like, oh, this works on a larger scale. We'll just like use the same methodology and just like bring it to a smaller scale. Like it's just, completely different settings. And so I think that there's something there too about um like how these stories were impactful in like allowing people to tell their story in the ways that numbers look different and in the ways that like they can apply for grants and apply for funding with their story in a like without the sort of like we've reached X amount of people and having it like really stand out, but saying like this is the impact we've had on this group of people and here are their words for it and things like that. And so it was just like I think it was just such a keen observation and then action in like in capturing this moment of possibility of how we support people in telling the story of the work they do in the context that they do it so that they can continue to do it as well.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and so I consider you somebody who takes storytelling and health seriously. And and there's others who are curious about it or sort of maybe think about it sometimes but aren't quite sure. Like, what would you tell other like leaders of health organizations who are on the fence about taking like storytelling and strategy built from story seriously?
Oh, goodness. Well, first of all, I would not tell anybody that I'm an expert on how to do the work, but I do think that there are people like you, like the folks at Telling My Story, who do understand how to make this happen. So I would start by saying it's super valuable. Find the partner you can work with who can make this real. Um, I would say I would probably ask some questions about what they know about the clients that they serve, how, and because I think many of these organizations already have a lot of stories.
Hmm.
When I'm talking about the provider organizations,
Hmm.
organizations like Wise and Listen and the Haven, et cetera, the people who work in those organizations know the stories of the
Yeah.
people who are there, who they impact. And I think that they know how to use those stories.
Hmm.
I think where it gets a little more complicated is when you are in, let's say, a healthcare setting
Hmm.
where they're trained to think that stories are unreliable
Yeah.
and not useful. So
Hmm.
when the vice president for population health tells me essentially that qualitative data is not real data,
Hmm.
I know that I'm not going to be able to get through to her
Hmm.
because it's not going to. And yet, I know that she really loved working with you,
Hmm.
right? So there's a disconnect,
Hmm.
right, between oh, we love the stories, but they're not real. They're not
Hmm.
something we can count on. And I think that's where I want people to understand. I was just talking to one of my students today who was doing literature reviews,
Hmm.
and he said, I only have about 12 articles that I downloaded because I started to see the same information in the others. It's
Hmm.
like, well, so that's the power of story.
Yeah.
When you start to hear themes running through different people's stories, then you know that you have found maybe something that is a more fundamental truth.
Hmm.
And um, and at the same time, I was asking him, like, you be able to say a little bit more about what one particular article says and how they define this term so that we can get ahead of people who start trying to discount that piece of information because they find a flaw in it.
Hmm.
Well, so when 10 different researchers or 10 different community members are telling you the same thing
Yeah.
with different decorations, it's important to say that is true,
Hmm. Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
What you do about it comes next, who's at fault and all these other
Hmm.
things. That's different. But it's important to just say, okay, I have to be able to accept that.
Hmm. Yeah, especially because that qualitative data, that story is the type of the hyper local data we can get as local decision makers that like the quantitative data is of course important. Like public health through and through, we need it all. We need both kinds. And those are often the findings of those are so divorced from the lived realities of the people who we are serving that, we need to round it out with that like hyper local listening and the story being seen value as valuable beyond the like goosebumps it can raise and things like that, but as the like you saying, like this is then true. And like what do we do with that truth that allows us to contextualize those other data points that we get in this local context in which we are deciding for and responsible to the community for making choices that support their health and thriving.
I agree with that.
Yeah.
I do think, however, that in a place like the Upper Valley, what I have found is anytime you go looking for data about, let's say, people of color,
Mm-hmm.
you can find out what percentage of the population identifies as any number of categories of non-white. You can get data on English speaking, non-English speaking, et cetera. But as soon as you start trying to dig down deeper into health,
Mm-hmm.
well-being, et cetera, the numbers become, and it's the N is too small to report.
Mm-hmm.
And I actually had an experience a few years ago where wanted so badly to find data to describe conditions for people of color in the Upper Valley, and it wasn't there. Or
Yeah.
we were working on a report for what's going on for kids of color in our schools, and
Mm-hmm.
every single one of the reports said we can't report on suspension and expulsion and these other data for kids of color because the N is too small.
Mm-hmm.
And I just felt, oh my God, these people are being told that they don't exist,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
Whereas their stories and the way they report on themselves would certainly counter that. Like there's,
That's
like
absolutely right.
the end certainly does exist and they're in our communities. And that's again where it's like, if we're taking just data from other rural contexts, that's a very different context than the one where we live in. And so like we need
Yeah,
that trust to be built so that we can then be in community with and be in conversation with the folks who are most impacted by the work we're doing.
absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, and
Yeah.
it amazes me that how um I don't know, it seems like we're in a moment or an era of like public health getting like more back to this, but it's like this was the origins of public health for so long was that hyper local community response, community health workers, things like that. And then we sort of lost our way, but it seems like we are coming back.
Yes, I think we are in some ways coming back. I worry. I read an article a year or so ago on the medicalization of public health.
Mm, mm-hmm,
And it really resonated for me that many of the things that you and I probably learned in our public health programs about the history of public health and the philosophy are being co-opted by
mm-hmm,
healthcare systems that discovered that they're only responsible for 10 to 15% of their patients' health outcomes.
mm,
And yet they're being held accountable for those health outcomes. And
mm-hmm,
therefore, they want to, in a sense, bring these public health initiatives under their own umbrella. So when someone says, oh, well, we want to get community nurses or community health workers to be reimbursable by insurance, no,
mm-hmm,
please, no.
mm-hmm.
Because as soon as it's reimbursable by insurance, now it's only available to people who have that
Yeah,
insurance.
yeah.
And that is precisely not public health,
Right.
right?
Yeah, right. And then
Yeah,
it buries the work under, the important work that folks could be doing under, mountains of paperwork and it just strips it of all of the goodness.
I have been more strategically stating my dissatisfaction with the notion that community health workers at Dartmouth never leave the institutional walls.
Mm, hmm.
Like, do you understand what a community health worker is supposed to
Yeah.
be? And
Yeah.
they look at me like, well, that's just not feasible. I was like,
Hmm.
of course it's not feasible because you're essentially using them as underpaid social
Right.
workers.
Yes, exactly.
They're not in the community. They're not of the community.
Hmm.
They're good people and
Yeah.
they're working hard. But now we have a whole states who think that community health workers are something other than what they're supposed to be.
Hmm.
And it drives me crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we're thinking about trying to pilot a digital health navigator project where you put people in the community to help people figure out how to use their tech.
So
And I'm like,
important.
you can't bring somebody to Lebanon and sit down with their device and figure out how they do a telehealth visit if you have no idea whether their internet works that way
Right.
when they're back home again.
Right. Yeah.
So yeah, it's yeah. So I think that there are folks who that definitely are understanding and are trying to get back to it. I think the countervailing force is to institutionalize
Yeah.
within healthcare settings a lot of the things that we believe are fundamentally about available to everybody in our communities as far out as you can possibly get it.
Yeah. Absolutely. Hmm. Such good stuff. Well, thank you, Alice, so much. It's always a pleasure to chat. And every time that you and I start a conversation, I'm like, if I had 4 more hours, we could talk about so much stuff. But
It's true.
yeah, so lovely to chat with you. And I hope to
Yeah.
reconnect soon. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate it. And please do keep me in the loop on what you're working on. And if there's any opportunity for us to work together again, we'd love that.
I would too. Thank you so
Okay.
much. All right.
Great.
Bye.
Bye bye.